welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. My name is Jason Kishineff, and we are reading an Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. Remember, if you like what you hear, please hit the like and subscribe button and hit that notification bell so you'll be notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Wounded Knee, 1890 and 1973. The period between the closing of the frontier, marked by the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, and the 1973 Siege of Wounded Knee, which marks the beginning of indigenous decolonization in North America, is illuminated by following the historical experience of the Sioux. The first international relationship between the Sioux Nation and the U.S. government was established in 1805 with the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, 2 years after the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory, which included the Sioux Nation among many other indigenous nations. Other such treaties followed in 1815 and 1825. These peace treaties had no immediate effect on Sioux political autonomy or territory. By 1834, competition in the fur trade, with the market dominated by the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, led the Oglala Sioux to move away from the upper Missouri to the upper Platte near Fort Laramie. By 1846, 7,000 Sioux had moved south. Thomas Fitzpatrick, the Indian agent in 1846, recommended that the United States purchase land to establish a fort, which became Fort Laramie. My opinion, Fitzpatrick wrote, is that a post at or in the vicinity of Laramie is much wanted. At or in the vicinity of Laramie is much wanted. It would be nearly in the center of the Buffalo Range, where all the formidable Indian tribes are fast approaching, and near where there will eventually be a struggle for the ascendancy in the fur trade. Fitzpatrick believed that a garrison of at least 300 soldiers would be necessary to keep the Indians under control. Although the Sioux and the United States redefined their relationship in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, this was followed by a decade of war between the two parties, ending with the peace Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868. Both of these treaties, though not reducing Sioux political sovereignty, ceded large parts of Sioux territory by establishing mutually recognized boundaries, and the Sioux granted concessions to the United States that gave legal color to the Sioux's increasing economic dependency on the United States and its economy. During the half-century before the 1851 treaty, the Sioux had been gradually enveloped in the fur trade and had become dependent on horses and European-manufactured guns, ammunition, iron cookware, tools, textiles, and other items of trade that replaced their traditional crafts. On the plains, the Sioux gradually abandoned farming and turned entirely to bison hunting for their subsistence and for trade. This increased dependency on the buffalo in turn brought deeper dependency on guns and ammunition that had to be purchased with more hides, creating the vicious circle that characterized modern colonialism. With the balance of power tipped by mid-century, U.S. traders and military exerted pressure on the Sioux for land cessions and rights of way as the buffalo population decreased. The hardships for the Sioux caused by constant attacks on their villages, forced movement, and resultant disease and starvation took a toll on their strength to resist domination. They entered into the 1868 treaty with the United States on strong terms from a military standpoint. The Sioux remained an effective guerrilla fighting force through the 1880s, never defeated by the U.S. Army, but their dependency on buffalo and on trade allowed for escalated federal control when buffalo were purposely exterminated by the Army between 1870 and 1876. After that, the Sioux were fighting for survival. Economic dependency on buffalo and trade was replaced with survival dependency on the U.S. government for rations and commodities guaranteed in the 1868 treaty. The agreement stipulated that no treaty for the cession of any portion or part of the reservation herein described, which may be held in common, shall be of any validation or force against the said Indians, unless executed and signed by at least 3/4 of all the adult male Indians. Nevertheless, in 1876, with no such validation, and with the discovery of gold by Custer's 7th Cavalry, the U.S. government seized the Black Hills, Pahasapa, a large, resource-rich portion of the treaty-guaranteed Sioux territory. Treaty-guaranteed Sioux territory. The center of the great Sioux nation, a religious shrine and sanctuary. When the Sioux surrendered after the wars of 1876 and 1877, they lost not only the Black Hills, but also the Powder River country. The next U.S. move was to change the western boundary of the Sioux nation, whose territory, though atrophied from its original, was a contiguous block. By 1877, after the Army drove the Sioux out of Nebraska, all that was left was a block between the 103rd Meridian and the Missouri, 35,000 square miles of land the United States had designated as Dakota Territory, the next step towards statehood, in this case the states of North and South Dakota. The first of several waves of northern European immigrants now poured into eastern Dakota Territory, pressing against the Missouri River boundary of the Sioux. At the Anglo-American settlement of Bismarck on the Missouri, the westward pushing Northern Pacific Railroad was blocked by the reservation. Settlers bound for Montana and the Pacific Northwest called for trails to be blazed and defended across the reservation. Promoters who wanted cheap land to sell at high prices to immigrants schemed to break up the reservation. Except for the Sioux units that continued to fight, the majority of the Sioux people were unarmed, had no horses, and were unable even to feed and clothe themselves, dependent on government rations. Next came allotment. Before the Dawes Act was even implemented, a government commission arrived in Sioux territory from Washington, D.C. in 1888 with the proposal to reduce the Sioux Nation to 6 small reservations, a scheme that would leave 9 million acres open for Euro-American settlement. The commission found it impossible to obtain signatures of the required 3/4 of the nation as required under the 1868 treaty, and so returned to Washington with the recommendation that the government ignore the treaty and take the land without Sioux consent. The only means to accomplish that goal was legislation. Congress having relieved the government of the obligation to negotiate a treaty. Congress commissioned General George Crook to head a delegation to try again, this time with an offer of $1.50 per acre. In a series of manipulations and dealings with leaders whose people were now starving, the commission garnered the needed signatures. The great Sioux nation was broken into small islands, soon surrounded on all sides by European immigrants, with much of the reservation land a checkerboard with settlers on allotments or leased land. Creating these isolated communities of the Sioux nation and opened areas where Europeans settled. What? Excuse me. Skip the line. Creating these isolated reservations broke the historical relationships between clans and communities of the Sioux nation and opened areas where Europeans settled. It also allowed the Bureau of Indian Affairs to exercise tighter control, buttressed by the Bureau's boarding school system. The Sundance, the annual ceremony that had brought Sioux together and reinforced national unity, was outlawed, along with other religious ceremonies. Despite the Sioux people's weak position under late 19th century colonial domination, they managed to begin building a modest cattle ranching business to replace their former bison hunting economy. In 1903, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock that a March 3, 1871 appropriations rider was constitutional and that Congress had plenary power to manage Indian property. The Office of Indian Affairs could thus dispose of Indian lands and resources regardless of the terms of previous treaty provisions. Legislation followed that opened the reservations to settlement through leasing and even sale of allotments taken out of trust. Nearly all prime grazing lands came to be occupied by non-Indian ranchers by the 1920s. By the time of the New Deal Collier era and nullification of Indian land allotment under the Indian Reorganization Act, non-Indians outnumbered Indians on the Sioux reservations 3-1. However, the drought of the mid to late 1930s drove many settler ranchers off Sioux land, and the Sioux purchased some of that land which had been theirs. However, tribal governments imposed in the wake of the Indian Reorganization Act proved particularly harmful and divisive for the Sioux. Concerning this measure, the late Matthew King, elder traditional historian of the Oglala Sioux of Pine Ridge, observed, "The Bureau of Indian Affairs drew up the Constitution and bylaws of this organization with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This was the introduction of home rule. The traditional people will still hang on to their treaty, for we are a sovereign nation. We have our own government. Home rule, or neocolonialism, proved a short-lived policy, however, for in the early 1950s, the United States developed its termination policy with legislation ordering gradual eradication of every reservation and even the tribal governments. At the time of termination and relocation, per capita annual income of the Sioux reservation stood at $355 per year, while that in nearby South Dakota towns was $2,500. Despite these circumstances, in pursuing its termination policy, the Bureau of Indian Affairs advocated the reduction of services and introduced its program to relocate Indians to urban industrial centers, with a high percentage of Sioux moving to San Francisco and Denver in search of jobs. Matthew King has described the United States throughout its history as alternating between a peace policy and a war policy in its relations with indigenous nations and communities, saying that these pendulum swings coincided with the strength and weakness of native resistance. Between the alternatives of extermination and termination, war policies, and preservation, peace policy, King argued, were interim periods characterized by benign neglect and assimilation, with organized indigenous resistance to war programs and policies. Concessions are granted. When pressure lightens, new schemes are developed to separate Indians from their land, resources, and cultures. Scholars, politicians, policymakers, and the media rarely turn U.S. policy toward indigenous peoples as colonialism. King, however, believed that his people's country had been a colony of the United States since 1890. The logical progression of modern colonialism begins with economic penetration and graduates to a sphere of influence, then to protectorate status or indirect control, military occupation, and finally annexation. This corresponds to the process experienced by the Sioux people in relation to the United States. The economic penetration of fur traders brought the Sioux within the U.S. sphere of influence. The transformation of Fort Laramie from a trading post, the center of Sioux trade, to a U.S. Army outpost in the mid-19th century indicates the integral relationship between trade and colonial control. Growing protectorate status established through treaties culminated in the 1868 Sioux Treaty, followed by military occupation achieved by extreme exemplary violence, such as at Wounded Knee in 1890, and finally dependency. Annexation by the United States is marked symbolically by the imposition of U.S. citizenship on the Sioux and most other Indians in 1924. Matthew King and other traditional Sioux saw the siege of Wounded Knee in 1973 as a turning point, although the violent backlash that followed was harsh. 2 decades of collective indigenous resistance, culminating at Wounded Knee in 1973, defeated the 1950s federal termination policy. Yet proponents of the disappearance of indigenous nations seem never to tire of trying. Another move toward termination developed in 1977, with dozens of congressional bills to abrogate all Indian treaties and terminate all Indian governments and trust territories. Indigenous resistance defeated those initiatives as well, with another caravan across the country. Like colonized peoples everywhere in the world, the Sioux have been involved in decolonization efforts since the mid-20th century. Wounded Knee in 1973 was part of this struggle, as was their involvement in UN committees and international forums. However, in the early 21st century, free market fundamentalist economists and politicians identified the communally owned indigenous reservation lands as an asset to be exploited, and under the guise of helping to end indigenous poverty on those reservations, Red flag already right there, huh? Call for doing away with them. A new extermination and termination initiative. Indian Wars as a template for the United States in the world. The integral link between Wounded Knee in 1890 and Wounded Knee in 1973 suggests a long overdue reinterpretation of indigenous U.S. relations as a template for U.S. imperialism and counterinsurgency wars. As Vietnam veteran and author Michael Herr, H-E-R-R, Michael Herr, observed, we might as well say that Vietnam was where the Trail of Tears was headed all along, the turnaround point where it would touch and come back to form a containing perimeter. Seminole Nation veteran Evan Haney made the comparison in testifying at the Winter Soldier investigations. The same massacres happened to the Indians. I got to know the Vietnamese people and I learned they were just like us. I have grown up with racism all my life. When I was a child watching cowboys and Indians on TV, I would root for the cavalry, not the Indians. It was that bad. I was that far toward my own destruction. As it happened, the 5th anniversary of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam occurred at the time of the 1973 siege of Wounded Knee. It was difficult to miss the analogy between the 1890 Wounded Knee massacre and the My Lai massacre, 1968. Alongside the front page news and photographs of the Wounded Knee siege that was taking place in real time were features with photos of the scene of mutilation and death at My Lai. Lieutenant William Rusty Calley was then serving his 20-year sentence under house arrest in luxurious officers' quarters at Fort Benning, Georgia, near his hometown. Wow, really? Yet he remained a national hero who received hundreds of support letters weekly, who was lauded by some as a POW being held by the U.S. military. One of Calley's most ardent defenders was Jimmy Carter, then governor of Georgia. In 1974, President Richard Nixon would pardon Calley. One of the documented acts among many that Calley committed and ordered others to carry out at My Lai took place when he saw a baby crawling from a ditch filled with mutilated, bloody bodies. He picked the baby up by a leg, threw the infant back into the pit, and then shot the baby point blank. My Lai was one of thousands of such slaughters led by officers just like Calley, who a few weeks before My Lai had been observed throwing a stooped old man down a well and firing his automatic rifle down the shaft. The ongoing siege at Wounded Knee in 1973 elicited some rare journalistic probing into the 1890 Army Massacre. In 1970, University librarian D. Brown had written the book Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which documented and told the 1890 Wounded Knee story, among many other such 19th century anti-Indian crimes and tragedies. The book was a surprise bestseller, so the name Wounded Knee resonated with the broad public in 1973. On the front page of one newspaper, editors placed two photographs side by side, each a pile of bloody, mutilated bodies in a ditch. One was from My Lai in 1968. the other from the Wounded Knee Army Massacre of the Lakota in 1890. Had they not been captioned, it would have been impossible to tell the difference in time and place. During the first U.S. military invasion of Iraq, a gesture intended to obliterate the Vietnam Syndrome, on February 19, 1991, Brigadier General Richard Neal, briefing reporters in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, stated that the U.S. military wanted to ensure a speedy victory once it committed land forces to Indian country. The following day, in a little publicized statement of protest, the National Congress of American Indians pointed out that 15,000 Native Americans were serving as combat troops in the Persian Gulf. As we have seen, the term Indian country is not merely an insensitive racial slur to indicate the enemy, tastelessly employed by accident. Neither Neal nor any other military authority ever apologized for the statement, and it continues to be used by the military and the media, usually in its shortened form, in country, which originated in the Vietnam War. Indian country and in country are military terms of trade, like other euphemisms such as collateral damage, which means killing civilians, and ordnance, which means bombs, that appear in military training manuals and are used regularly. Indian country and in country mean behind enemy lines. Its current use should serve to remind us of the origins and development of the U.S. military, as well as the nature of our political and social history, annihilation unto unconditional surrender. When the redundant ground war, more appropriately tagged a turkey shoot, was launched at the front of the miles of killing machines were armored scouting vehicles of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, a self-contained elite unit that won fame during World War II when it headed George Patton's Third Army crossing Europe. In the Gulf War, the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment played the role of chief scouts for the U.S. 7th Corps. A retired ACR commander proudly told a television interviewer that the 2nd ACR had been formed in the 1830s to fight the Seminoles, and that it had its first great victory when it finally defeated those Indians in the Florida Everglades in 1836. The 2nd ACR is the vanguard of the ground assault on Iraq, thus symbolized the continuity of U.S. war victories and the source of the nation's militarism. The Iraq War was just another Indian war in the military tradition. After weeks of high-tech bombing in Iraq, followed by a caravan of armored tanks shooting everything that moved, the U.S. Special Forces entered Iraqi office quarters in Kuwait City. There they found carrier pigeons in cages and notes in Arabic strewn over a desk, which they interpreted to mean that the Iraqi commanders were communicating with their troops and even with Baghdad using the carrier pigeons. High-tech soldiers had been fighting an army that communicated by carrier pigeon, as Shawnees and Muskogees had done 2 centuries earlier. 12 years after the Gulf War, a U.S. military force of 300,000 invaded Iraq again. A Little Red report from Associated Press correspondent Ellen Nickmeyer illustrates the symbolic power of Indian wars as a source of U.S. military memory and practice. Once again, we find the armored scouting vehicles and their troops retracing historical bloody footprints as they perform their seminal Indian war dance. Captain Philip Wolford's men leaped into the air and waved empty rifles in an impromptu desert war dance with thousands of M1A1 Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, and trucks. The mechanized infantry unit known as the Iron Fist would be the only U.S. armored division in the fight and would likely meet any Iraqi defenses head on. "We will be entering Iraq as an army of liberation, not domination," said Wolford at Marysville, Ohio, directing the men of his 4th Battalion, 64th Armored Regiment to take down the U.S. flags fluttering from their sand-colored tanks. After a brief prayer, Wolford leaped into an impromptu desert war dance. Camouflaged soldiers joined him, jumping up and down in the sand, chanting and brandishing rifles carefully emptied of their rounds. History not past. In April 2007, all the news seemed to be coming from Virginia and was about murder. The murder of indigenous farmers that commenced 400 years before with the founding of Jamestown and the rampage at nearby Virginia Tech University on April 16, 2007. Yet no one commented in the media on the juxtaposition of these bookends of colonialism. Jamestown was famously the first permanent settlement that gave birth to the Commonwealth of Virginia, the colonial epicenter of what became the United States of America nearly 2 centuries later, the colony out of which was carved the U.S. capital, Washington, on the river whose mouth lay up the coast. A few years after Jamestown was established, the more familiar and revered colony of Plymouth was planted by English religious dissidents under the auspices of private investors with royal approval. As with Jamestown and the same mercenary activities personified by Captain John Smith. This was the beginning of British overseas colonialism. After the conquest and colonization of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland turned England into Great Britain. The Virginia Tech killings were described in 2007 as the worst mass killing, the worst massacre in U.S. history. Descendants of massacred indigenous ancestors took exception to that designation. It was curious with the media circus surrounding the Jamestown celebration and with Queen Elizabeth and President Bush presiding that journalists failed to compare the colonial massacres of Powhatans 4 centuries earlier and the single disturbed individual's shooting of his classmates. The shooter himself was a child of colonial war, the U.S. war in Korea. Meditating on the 5 major U.S. wars since World War II, in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, 1991, Afghanistan, and Iraq, 2003. With flashes of historical memory of Jamestown, the Ohio Valley, and Wounded Knee, brings us to the essence of U.S. history. A red thread of blood connects the first white settlement in North America with today and with the future. As military historian John Grenier puts it, U.S. people are taught that their military culture does not approve of or encourage targeting and killing civilians, and know little or nothing about the nearly 3 centuries of warfare before and after the founding of the U.S. that reduced the indigenous peoples of the continent to a few reservations by burning their towns and fields and killing civilians, driving the refugees out step by step across the continent. Violence directed systematically against non-combatants through irregular means from the start has been a central part of Americans' way of war. And that's the end of chapter 10. Thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, you know what to do, and I'll see you next episode.